You just have to show that you have reasonable fear of imminent harm. Georgia's a stand your ground state. You don't have to flee. You don't have to run away. But you do have to respond proportionally. So if you're, I guess it's very fact specific. So if someone that's roughly your size is about to attack you, like say the misdemeanor case I was telling you about, and they pull out their fists, you can't pull out a gun and blow them away because that's not a proportional response. Now that could change if, say, the person who's pulling out their fists is, a 300-pound man, and the defendant is a 95-pound woman. Because in that situation, the fists go from being, a weapon to a deadly weapon potentially. So it's going to be very fact specific. What were the circumstances? But the response is supposed to be proportional, and the threat has to be imminent. It can't be. You get into an argument and the guy says, "Okay, I'm going to go home and get my gun, and we're going to settle this." Because you've got time in there to say call the police and report it. He has to be pulling out the gun, and it's either act or die, really. Evidence-wise, fortunately, or unfortunately, I guess, depending on what your perspective is, modern day, there's a lot of video, so we get a lot more of it caught on camera, as in the case with that misdemeanor I was just telling you about, where we had security camera, but you also get cell phone footage and things like that. The murder case, there was no video. It was all testimony, and oftentimes, it's just you. It's just your word, your client's word, versus someone who, and like the case of the murder, is deceased. So in that case, it was, a guy who's got a very strong motive to save himself, testifying that he acted in self-defense, versus a person who was deceased. And of course, the state's going to point that out. They're going to say, well, you've heard one version of the story, but the other version you can't hear because he took that person's life. So that's where it gets tricky, because if you're going to argue self-defense, you've got to present some evidence to that effect, especially in an immunity hearing, where you've got the burden. And if there's no video, a lot of times, it's you've got to put your client up to testify, which, as they show in popular media on TV and movies, you almost never want to subject your client to cross-examination, even when they're innocent. There's just such an imbalance of power there with a seasoned prosecutor doing the questioning versus someone who, in most cases, has never testified in anything in their life. But in a self-defense case, a lot of times you don't really have a choice. If you're going to get the evidence out there, well, we were alone in this alley or alone in this room in this house, and he pulled a gun on me and I felt like I was going to die, and we were the only two in the room. There's, if there's no other way to get that evidence in there, you have to do it through testimony. Obviously, it's great if there's witnesses that you can get to testify for you, or video footage of some kind, but short of that, you end up with testimony, and then it's, if you've just got the testimony of a defendant, practically speaking, your standard in an immunity hearing is the civil standard, just more likely than not. But, in practical terms, a judge is going to be hesitant in any circumstance to take that decision away from a jury without compelling evidence. And particularly in a situation like this, I mean, your testimony would have to be overwhelming, and other circumstances. So taking the example I gave of, say, the 300-pound man versus the 95-pound woman, if you have evidence of prior acts of domestic violence or something like that, like say, hey, he was, called the police on 8 different occasions, pictures of prior black eyes and things like that, that would go to bolster her testimony, in an immunity hearing.